In a world divided by kingdoms,
For the Mongol Empire!
one empire rose like a storm,
Leave nothing behind! For the Khan!
unstoppable,
Nothing left behind them, Desert! No mercy! Death rides with us!
unbroken, and unchallenged.
That is very challenging. For our land, for our people, for victory! Turn! Attack!
What if they never stopped? What if every city, every nation, every border fell beneath the Mongol banner? From Europe to America, from the Great Wall to the farthest oceans, the world speaks one name, Genghis Khan.
Go and fight for your freedom!
But when one power rules all, does peace rise or freedom die?
Victory! For the Horde!
Imagine waking up in a world where one passport, stamped under the Great Khan, takes you from Venice to Beijing, Cairo to Delhi, and Samarkand to Paris without a single checkpoint stopping you for long. Would the modern world as we know it still exist? Or would everything from our languages to our technology feel familiar yet fundamentally different? Tonight, we dive into a meticulously researched what if, blending documented facts with careful, clearly labeled speculation to explore the world that might have been if the Mongols had built and held a truly global empire. Promise of value. No fluff, no misinformation, just a gripping ride through history's biggest crossroads and how a few turns might have rewritten our present. Quick rule of the game. When I speculate, I'll say so, and when I lean on solid history, I'll cite known practices and events. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan fused the fractious tribes of the steppe into a shockingly disciplined military and administrative machine that changed Afro-Eurasia forever. They were devastating in war, yes, but they were also pragmatic empire builders who recruited the best talent they could find, from Chinese siege engineers to Persian viziers, Uyghur scribes, Turkic generals, and Arab navigators. They built a communication web called the YAM, a relay system of stations every 25 to 40 kilometers with fresh horses and supplies, so messages and officials could move at astonishing speed for the era. They invested in state merchant partnerships, often called ortoch, which pooled capital and spread risk, acting like a medieval venture capital mechanism for long-distance trade. They practiced a broad religious tolerance that allowed Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Nestorians, and shamans to coexist under imperial law, so long as taxes were paid and order was kept. And while we know of the Yasa, a body of Mongol imperial law, we do not possess a definitive, complete text, so what we reliably infer are principles such as discipline, collective liability for certain offences, protected trade, and harsh penalties for theft or desertion. This is the factual foundation, and it matters because it shows the Mongols were not simply raiders, but system builders with a clear sense of logistics, incentives, and information flow. The big forks in the road. To reach a Mongol global empire, a few historical turning points needed to go differently, and here is where the careful speculation begins. Fork 1, Europe, 1241 to 1242. Fact first, the Mongols crushed European armies at Legnica in Poland and Mohi in Hungary, but abruptly withdrew when Ogedei Khan died, because succession demanded the leading princes return to the Mongol heartland to choose their next great Khan. Speculation. If that succession had been settled or delayed differently, Mongol forces likely would have consolidated Central Europe, imposed tribute systems on fragmented principalities, and struck deals with Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa for Mediterranean access. That would have integrated Europe into an imperial tax and trade framework instead of leaving it as a set of competing states pushing outward by sea in later centuries. Fork 2. The Middle East, 1260. Fact, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks of Egypt handed the Mongols their first major open field defeat in the region, stopping a westward surge. Speculation, if intra-Mongol politics between the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde had stabilized, and if a sustained, coordinated push had taken Egypt and key Levantine ports, the empire would have controlled both the Silk Road and the Red Sea gateways to the Mediterranean. That would have fused overland caravans and maritime choke points into a single sovereign logistics architecture. Fork 3. The Oceans, 1270s to 1280s. Fact, the Mongols attempted 2 naval invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, which failed due to storms and a host of logistical and tactical factors. Fact as well, the Yuan dynasty controlled major Chinese shipyards, compasses, stern post rudders, and access to experienced Korean and Chinese sailors. Speculation had an enduring Mongol polity prioritized maritime investment and learned systematically from those failures, integrating Arab navigational knowledge and Indian Ocean monsoon timing. An imperial convoy system could have dominated routes from the South China Sea to the Red Sea. This pivot is crucial because it turns a continental empire into a thalassocracy as well, making Eurasia's arteries both land and sea under the same umbrella. A plausible alternate timeline, high level and cautious. 1237 to 1250, Central and Eastern Europe are subdued, with tribute regimes, census-based taxation, and hosts of paisa merchants moving through imperial corridors. 1260 to 1280, Egypt and the Levant are taken in this scenario, folding Alexandria, Damascus, and Acre into an imperial customs world that links the Nile, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf. 1270s to 1300, Yuan China remains stable longer, and southern shipyards scale up Indian Ocean convoys guarded by imperial escorts, managing risk through Ortog-style finance and regulated tolls. 13th century, a Pax Mongolica 2.0 spreads order across Eurasia, but then the Black Death still arrives, moving quickly along the very networks that made goods and ideas flow. 1350 to 1400. After population shocks, the empire centralizes certain reforms, including labor policies, plague management protocols, cadastral surveys for taxation, and incentives for agricultural recovery and artisan guilds. 1400s to 1500s, an imperial observatory network standardizes star charts for navigation and calendars for taxation and ritual, drawing on Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian astronomy, while gunpowder standards reduce local arms races but keep siege and artillery development steady. This is speculative, but it stays close to documented Mongol administrative styles, incentives, and the technologies within their reach. Would our modern world still happen? The short answer is yes in some ways and no in others, but the longer answer is far more interesting and revealing. Trade and the age of discovery under a global khanate. In our real timeline, Europe's maritime expansion accelerated as political fragmentation, shifting Levantine and Mediterranean power and increasing transaction costs across Eurasia, pushed states to seek maritime alternatives to reach Asian markets. In a Mongol world with safe overland routes and a unified customs regime, the urgency for risky Atlantic forays would have been lower for European polities now embedded in an imperial trade order. Maritime exploration would still occur, especially if the empire itself pursued Indian Ocean dominance. But the incentive structure shifts from desperate workaround to empire-backed expansion of already profitable routes. Result? Contact with the Americas likely arrives later or under tightly regulated imperial or semi-imperial expeditions rather than fragmented competitive ventures, which alters the tempo and character of the Columbian exchange. The flow of crops like potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and chilies would still transform diets, but on a different timeline and perhaps under stricter quarantine protocols learned from plague experience. The devastation from Eurasian diseases in the Americas would still be severe, because immunity patterns do not change, but staged contact and variolation or quarantine experiments might slightly alter the spread in some regions compared with uncontrolled pandemics. All of that remains speculative, but anchored in how a unified empire tends to manage risk, regulate ports, and enforce standards for ship crews and caravans. Politics and the fate of the nation-state. In our world, the European nation-state system hardened through centuries of rivalry, treaties, and war, with sovereignty and borders codified in a Westphalian logic. Under a global Mongol framework, governance likely takes the shape of imperial satrapies or regional khanates, co-opting local elites while enforcing regular census, taxation, and audits. Local identity survives and thrives, but political sovereignty is layered beneath imperial law, imperial roads, and imperial security guarantees, which slows the crystallization of modern nation-states as primary actors. Parliamentary democracy, in its familiar form, does not vanish as a concept, but aristocratic councils, guild assemblies, and advisory bodies tied to the court likely play a larger role than mass national legislatures for a long time. Law emphasizes trade protection, movement controls during crises, safe passage for licensed merchants, and severe penalties for theft or brigandage, reflecting step discipline fused with sedentary bureaucratic norms. Religious institutions retain spiritual authority, but their political independence is curtailed by imperial oversight that applies to bishops, ulama, lamas, and abbots alike. Science and the direction of innovation. The scientific revolution in our world was a product of many causes, including patronage networks, the printing press, experimental habits, and competitive fragmentation that rewarded novelty in some contexts. In a Mongol-led global order, knowledge highways look different because Chinese printing, paper, gunpowder, and the compass move westward earlier and more systematically under imperial sponsorship. Observatories modeled on Maragay and later Samarkand are replicated from Cairo to Khanbalik, with standardized star catalogues serving navigation, taxation calendars, and ritual schedules. A cross-imperial academy network emerges, carrying Persian mathematical traditions, Chinese mechanical engineering, and Arabic optics into shared curricula, because the empire needs precise surveys, reliable navigation, and predictable logistics. Here is the twist. Centralized order accelerates diffusion of known techniques, but can dampen the wild arms race innovation we saw in fragmented Europe, especially in weapons and shipbuilding. So the curve of discovery bends toward big, state-backed projects, improved instruments, and robust standardization, while maverick breakthroughs may face gatekeeping unless patronage protects them. Printing spreads widely, but is more regulated, resulting in literacy growth that aligns with administrative needs and merchant demands without the same level of uncontrolled pamphlet wars that characterized parts of Europe. Scientific method still develops because navigation, siegecraft, and fiscal astronomy require verifiable results. But the cultural politics around heresy and orthodoxy look different under an empire that values order and pluralism over confessional supremacy. The Black Death in a unified empire. The plague still arrives in the 14th century because microbes do not respect flags or frontiers. Its spread might even be faster along efficient imperial routes, which is a sobering cost of integration. The response, however, could be more coordinated, with quarantines at caravanserais, inspection of waybills, isolation rules for ships, and the establishment of plague hospitals based on shared protocols circulated through the YAM. Labor scarcity raises wages in many regions, which historically drove innovation. And under a single fiscal authority, the empire could formalize labor contracts, offer land grants to resettle depopulated areas, and invest in mills, canals, and flood control to stabilize food supply. This creates conditions for mechanization in select hubs and aligns with the empire's preference for large public works that yield measurable returns in tax revenues and stability. Culture, language, and everyday life. An imperial lingua franca likely emerges in administration, perhaps a Turkic-Persian blend in the West, and a Chinese bureaucratic standard in the East, while local languages continue in daily life and art. Latin remains in Europe's church and scholarship circles, but prestige shifts to Chancery Persian, Turkic, and the imperial script standards that win government jobs. Religious plurality is enforced as policy, reducing the chance of massive sectarian wars, but also limiting any one institution from monopolizing education or courts. Architecture synthesizes Persian domes, Chinese timber engineering, Central Asian tile work, and European stone vaulting under the budgets of imperial patrons. Your travel document looks like a Paisa 2.0, a stamped credential tied to imperial ledgers, granting tiered access to relays, ferries, and secure lodging, all regulated and taxed. Merchants become cultural brokers, couriers of recipes, medicines, ledgers, and stories because the empire essentially subsidizes their safety to grease the wheels of revenue. Foodways blend slowly until American crops arrive, at which point imperial kitchens test, adopt, and regulate seed flow, while tea and dairy from steppe and East Asian traditions become global comfort staples. Slavery, serfdom, and labor under empire. The Mongols enslaved captives in war and moved populations for skilled labor, but they also protected merchants and artisans, creating incentives that favored productive guilds over arbitrary exactions. In a global empire, coerced labor does not disappear, but it competes with protected urban crafts and the empire's need for taxable free producers. If contact with the Americas is later and more controlled, the transatlantic slave trade as we know it is delayed or reshaped, though coerced systems might arise in imperial plantations or state farms elsewhere, depending on revenue pressures and moral legal norms that evolve under imperial law. Over time, predictable taxes and stable contracts push more regions toward wage labor and guild privileges, because the state wants consistent revenue more than it wants chaos. Infrastructure and the physics of order. The yam becomes a megastructure, linking stone-paved caravan roads, river barges, and coastal convoys under one schedule that a merchant can actually plan around. Imperial surveys map floodplains, canals, forests, and mines, and that empirical impulse feeds into early statistics and logistics manuals used by governors and guilds. Bridges and caravanserais extend deep into forests and steppes, with standardized measurements for road widths, axle sizes, and load limits, making overland freight cheaper and safer. Environmentally, after plague-driven reforestation, agricultural expansion resumes with more water management, and the empire sets quotas to prevent timber shortages that would cripple shipyards or siege works. It is a world that knows how much wood a province cuts because the tax ledger demands the answer. Europe. Inside the empire cathedrals still ring their bells, but bishops negotiate with imperial tax assessors and submit to travel regulations like everyone else. Universities such as Paris and Bologna survive and even flourish, but their departments tilt toward astronomy, accountancy, translation bureaus, engineering, and languages of administration that promise state employment. Local dukes keep titles and land, but owe regular musters and money, and their castles host imperial garrisons that ensure roads stay open and merchants are compensated when robbed. Renaissance humanists still translate Greek texts, but they do so alongside Persian mathematicians and Chinese mechanicians visiting under imperial fellowships. Printing in Europe arrives and spreads, but licensing ties printers to imperial deposit libraries that collect copies to monitor seditious tracts and preserve technical manuals for consistency. China and the maritime turn. The Yuan machine blends steppe military command with Chinese bureaucracy, rewarding civil military talent and promoting engineers who can solve logistical bottlenecks. Southern shipyards on the Fujian and Guangdong coasts turn out convoy vessels with standardized hulls, watertight bulkheads, and multilingual crews under strict rotations. Arab and Indian pilots teach monsoon cycles, Chinese craftsmen perfect large rudders, and Persian cartographers systematically update pilot books and star tables shared across the observatory network. This collaboration does not eliminate storms or pirates, but it makes insurance calculable, which makes long voyages bankable, which in turn reshapes the map of commerce. The Middle East is imperial hub Cairo, Damascus, Tabriz, and Baghdad become pinwheels of finance, where Waqf endowments, imperial treasuries, and merchant partnerships cohabit under law that standardizes contracts across regions. Sharia courts remain vital for civil matters, but imperial law governs highways, ports, coinage standards, and the mail, ensuring predictability across sects and languages. Scholars trained in astronomy, algebra, and medicine circulate between madrasas, imperial academies, and court workshops that make astrolabes, clocks, and gunpowder devices to specify. The result is a cosmopolitan corridor from the Nile to the Oxus, where a merchant can litigate a dispute in one city and enforce the judgment in another without reinventing the legal wheel. Guns, paper, and the pace of progress. Gunpowder, paper money experiments, and printing are not mere curiosities. They are tools that the empire tries to standardize and control because they affect war, tax, and knowledge. Weapons innovation keeps pace with imperial needs, but without dozens of rival states racing, the ceiling is set by central procurement and doctrine rather than panic and desperation. On the other hand, measurement culture thrives because the empire rewards officials who can deliver predictable outcomes, and that attitude spills into mathematics, astronomy, and engineering in ways that look modern to us. An imperial royal society equivalent might emerge, but as a chartered bureau with practical mandates like improving canal locks, standardizing powder granulation, or reducing ship losses on specific routes. Would industrialization still happen, and where? Industrialization in our world took off in Britain for a complex mix of reasons, including coal access, high wages in some sectors, imperial markets, property rights, and culture of tinkering, among others. In a Mongol global empire, the pattern could shift towards state-driven industrial clusters where coal, water power, and skilled guilds intersect under imperial sponsorship. North China's coalfields in Shaanxi and Shanxi, Central Asian textile towns with canal power, or Central European metallurgical hubs within the imperial tax net could become the first to mechanize. The timing might be later or more uneven than in our world, because centralized peace reduces the arms race pressure to adopt every cost-cutting invention immediately. But when the empire wants output, it can scale brutally fast. Industrialization would not be purely laissez-faire. It would be ledger-driven, with quotas, contracts, and state credit replacing some of the speculative private bubbles we associate with early capitalism. The Americas and Africa, under a different clock. If the Atlantic push is delayed or reoriented, contact with the Americas happens under imperial or semi-imperial supervision, with stricter port quarantines and tighter monopoly rules. The Columbian exchange still transforms diets and economies, but the political beneficiaries look different, with imperial satrapies or chartered merchant leagues instead of rival national crowns carving empires. In Africa, the Indian Ocean and Red Sea corridors inside the imperial system make East African ports boom even more, while trans-Saharan routes enjoy garrisoned protection that supports caravan cities with stable customs. The Atlantic slave trade, as we know it, is curtailed or postponed, not because the empire is inherently moral, but because its preferred revenue tools are taxable, reproducible, and administratively clean, while chattel exports create political blowback and instability that threaten roads and ports. Coerced labor sadly remains in various forms, but the geography and legal structures differ, and emancipation debates emerge inside a single imperial parliament of notables rather than across warring states. Common misconceptions clarified. No, the Mongols were not only destroyers, even though early campaigns were extraordinarily brutal, because the later imperial phase protected trade, standardized tolls, and sponsored scholars and artisans when it served fiscal stability. No, we do not possess a definitive Yasa code, so responsible historians infer general legal principles from chronicles and practice rather than reciting a chapter-and-verse statute book. Yes, the Mongols ran fleets during the Japanese invasions and had access to the best shipyards of East Asia, even if maritime culture was not their native strength, which means a naval pivot was difficult, but not impossible. Yes, the Black Death was tied to trade networks, including Mongol-linked routes, Yet that is a feature of all integrated systems, and later states of every kind struggled with similar dynamics when railways and steamships arrived. Fragility and why a global empire might still break. Succession was the Mongol Achilles heel, and even a well-run empire could fracture without clear rules adhered to by powerful princes. Overextension and regional elites could corrode central authority, especially if tax farming created local oligarchs who behaved like mini-states. Ideological rigidity could emerge over time, as bureaucracies guard their privileges and stifle dissenting minds whose experiments do not fit the ledger. None of this is unique to the Mongols, but it reminds us that all empires are machines under tension, needing constant calibration to avoid either tyranny or disintegration. So, would the modern world exist or not? If by modern world you mean a global system of nation-states dominated by Europe, with English as a lingua franca and a specific Atlantic-centered chronology of discovery and industry, then probably not. If by modern you mean urbanization, global trade, scientific instruments, mass printing, industrial energy, and bureaucratic states that manage vast populations with standardized rules, then yes, but with different centers, clocks, and accents. Picture a modernity where Samarkand, Cairo, Khanbalik, Tabriz, and Prague share top billing in science, and where the default language of your shipping app is a Turkic-Persian administrative dialect, while your tax form uses Chinese-derived numerals and calendrical cycles. Imagine the same phone in your pocket, but the star charts behind its GPS lineage bear the seals of imperial observatories unified since the 14th century. Envision a world where elections, where they exist, feel more like guild and city councils feeding into imperial assemblies, and where your freedom to travel depends on a licensed credential rooted in a tradition older than the modern passport. It is modern, just not ours, grown from a different seed of order that favored road security, merchant protection, and measured timekeeping over the permanent rivalry of independent states. A glimpse of daily life in this alternate present. You check your travel tier on your Paisa credential, which renews annually after tax settlement and guild verification. You board an imperial ferry that accepts standardized coinage and stamped notes whose authenticity a dock official checks against last night's yam dispatch. At lunch, your vendor serves lamb kebab with buckwheat noodles and a chili sauce that entered the empire through a chartered Atlantic port 2 centuries later than in our world. Your engineer friend works at a canals and mills office that shares floor space with an observatory annex recalibrating star charts after a new comet sighting. Your bookshelf holds a licensed printing of a mechanic's manual from Cairo, a poetry collection from Tabriz, and a bilingual ledger guide approved for merchant exams in Prague. At sunset, the mosque, the church, and a Buddhist temple share a courtyard market overseen by an imperial magistrate who fines anyone that disrupts the peace or price posts without permission. It is orderly, eclectic, and buzzing with motion, because the empire knows its revenues depend on you moving safely from one point to another. Answering a final objection, would curiosity survive without constant war between states? Yes, curiosity thrives whenever people, tools, and incentives align. And here, the incentives reward precision, replication, and reliability. Exploration still happens, but the flag on the mast is imperial or chartered, and the captain files a route plan with the observatory bureau so the maps can be updated. Artists still rebel, scientists still argue, and merchants still push boundaries because no empire can plan every idea that a restless mind produces. What changes is the scaffolding around that restlessness, which is more standardized, more credentialed, and more predictable in its rewards and punishments. Closing thought and verdict. A Mongol global empire would likely have produced a modernity built around secure corridors, regulated openness, cross-cultural scholarship, and ledger-driven innovation that values instruments and infrastructure as much as inspiration. Our world would be different in its language of power and its map of fame, but familiar in its technologies of measure, movement, and memory. In short, the modern world would exist, but its accent, its heroes, and its milestones would have changed, like a familiar song played in a different key. Credits and care for accuracy. Every historical claim here about the Yam, Paisa, or Tor partnerships, religious tolerance, the uncertainty of the Yasa text, the battles of Legnica, Mohi, and Ain Jalut, and the failed invasions of Japan is grounded in widely accepted scholarship. Every forward-looking claim is labeled as speculation, consistent with known Mongol practices of administration, logistics, and adaptation. If you want sources, look for work by scholars on Mongol administration, Silk Road commerce, and the cross-pollination of Chinese, Persian, and Arab science during the 13th and 14th centuries. This is how we keep imagination tethered to reality without strangling it. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive alternate history, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because I'm bringing more videos like this your way, and you won't want to miss them. Hit the bell so you are first in line for the next big what if, and drop a comment telling me which part of this alternate world you would most like to live in and why. Thanks for watching, and until next time, imagine boldly and think critically.